learning tours, and so much more. Esri, thank you for reminding to record. There are a number of people who signed up and they will be watching the recording of this. So you saved me from having to do the same lecture twice because I forgot to do that. So appreciate that. Um, and so that is the work that we do at the Institute. Some of you are very brand new to us. You may have gone to the teach-in that we just had, or this is the first thing that you are doing. Others come to a number of things that we do all the time, and we appreciate that support so much. I'm so excited about this lecture tonight because I love talking about Juneteenth. I love talking about Texas. It's one of the, it's the space where I've done so much research, public history research, and work. And I have my first monograph coming out of there. So this is really exciting. And it is fascinating to talk about it in the context of America at 250 and the way that America at 250 is being celebrated coming out of this administration and even before this administration, which is one of the things we'll talk about. And so the structure for the evening will be this. First and foremost, we seek at the Institute always to inform and empower people. Our motto is education to action. Education without action is a privilege. What that action looks like, there's no one way to have action. We have the option for you to knock on doors. Action may be the way that if you are an educator, you teach in the classroom. Action may be the conversations that you have with family and friends, the ways that you use social media, you being a poll watcher, voting. Action can look very different for everybody, but the education should inform some type of action. And so as we're looking at this lecture in 3 parts, and they're not all equal kind of amount spent on each part, but I have divided it into 3 parts. I like to do that as an organizing force to allow people to kind of see where we're going next with something. And so in the first part, we will talk about truth being under assault and what Juneteenth means in the context of America at 250. And then in the second part, we're going to talk about Texas, Mexico, and slavery and the system of slavery in those moments, some of the myths associated with Texas, and the process of freedom. So we'll learn for part 3 how we arrive at Juneteenth in Texas and what life was like after emancipation. I don't want to end with what General Gordon Granger read. I want to look at then what it meant to be free in Texas very specifically. And as part of part 3, as we'll go into the end of this, we'll talk about Juneteenth today, how we arrived at a federal holiday, first a state holiday and the federal holiday, and then where we are today. All throughout, you have a chance to ask questions. So if it is something that you ask right now and it's related to kind of the topic I'm talking about, if you want clarification, Esri will let me know. She will stop me and say, hey, we have a question. So feel free to put anything you want in the chat. In addition to that, feel free to communicate with one another in the chat. That is why it is there. History is a self-help book. Those of you who have interacted with me, those of you I know already, those of you who we have learned together, you hear about me talking about history as a self-help book because I firmly believe this and I live by this dictate, that it informs us. It can inform the way we maneuver in this world, both personally and professionally. History gives us strategy, perseverance, resilience, a commitment to justice, courage, because I always say courage does not mean that you're not afraid. Courage means maybe you did something even though you were afraid. It is not the absence of fear. It is doing it even if you are potentially afraid. And so history teaches us all of these lessons. And so when I do a lecture, increasingly, I ask for you to think about what you can draw from this history. What are you learning about strategy? Even from a small story, maybe I'll tell, or one individual or an organization about perseverance, resilience, commitment to justice. And I urge you to take notes on what inspires you, what lessons you are learning. Maybe you open it up in your phone. I can give you a moment to go and grab a pen and paper because there are things that we want to write down and take with us. I'm not saying you need to take diligent notes. If you want more of the history, I'm going to send this recording out to all of you. But it is useful to think about those things that inspire us. Many of you have met Dr. Bernard Lafayette. And for those of you who are new, he was a civil rights hero, an icon. He passed away a couple of months ago, and he was very much a friend of us in the Institute and a mentor, known him for a number of years, and he would just say some of the most incredible things. Now, to be clear, I am not suggesting that I am going to have any kind of the wisdom or anything that he is saying. I am using historical figures like him to say that when he would say things, I would write them down and take them away. And so when you're learning about the people I'm going to talk about, there may be something from that person or their action that inspires you the way that Dr. Lafayette inspired me. And so I encourage you to write down some of the lessons that you are learning, even in the things that are tough, even in the things that are tough. When tonight we learn about the way people traversed those things, the responses to it, that sets us up for lessons for life. So some of the central themes for tonight would be Juneteenth and the idea of independence. And I'm going to stick on that idea of independence because it's something that has, yes, Martina, thank you. Rest in power to Dr. Lafayette. It is something that has resonates in many different ways and has actually upset some people in thinking about Juneteenth as a form of independence. So we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about America at 250. Slavery in Texas, of course. We often don't talk about slavery in Texas. People don't know much about it in the way that they do other states. So we'll look at that. When did freedom arrive in Texas and how? What does Juneteenth mean? What did freedom mean to formerly enslaved people in the state of Texas? How did they begin to restructure their lives? And how did they begin to exercise political power? What were the repercussions of that? And then how do we celebrate Juneteenth today? Those are some of the themes that we're going to cover. Again, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. Esri will let me know. And I thank you for being here tonight, for being engaged, for paying attention, for wanting to learn more about this history. And so we're starting here with part 1, history and truth are under attack. America at 250 and the meaning of independence. And the thing that I want to say is something that I said at the teach-in, if you were there this past Sunday. We had a beautiful teach-in. Dr. David Domke, my colleague, was on the ground in Selma and in Montgomery. Dr. Dr. Uhuru Williams was in Minnesota, where some of you are. I was here. We met with Mr. Charles Malden. We had the honor of meeting also with Representative Shamari Figures and Dr. Kay Whitehead. And we talked about voting justice. And one of the things I said at the very beginning was some of the history that we taught. This was history. It was not opinion. It was not hyperbole. We would not be able to teach in school districts all over this country. And that includes some of what I'm going to be talking about tonight. It is deemed CRT, it is deemed DEI, it is deemed something that is not acceptable. Let's keep that in mind. Nothing I'm telling you tonight is, well, you will hear some of my opinions about this administration. So that's not the thing I would teach in the school. But the actual history that I'll be teaching is something that would be banned in so many places. And I'll start with this. I'm sure that you know what this is. Be as interactive as you would like in the chat. This is the wrestling arena that is being built on the White House lawn to celebrate America at 250. A number of individuals and organizations, and not even across partisan lines, many who have identified for many years as Republican, are pulling out of the celebration because of the ways that it is being used and misused, and because of the what has come out of this administration in the way that it has demonized and really subjugated so many people, particularly marginalized people. And so I'm starting with this. Yolanda, right. Your estimation of that is exactly my sentiment as well. And I start with this because it begins to function as a window into, and in some ways a metaphor for the way America is being celebrated at 250 years by this administration very specifically. And the way that this administration characterizes it trickles down to other municipalities and states. And some of it started long before Trump's election, and we'll talk about that. If we assume that he is the reason for the season and the condemnation of Black history and so forth, we would be wrong. He is a continuation of something that has always existed. But I show that to contrast it with this. Earlier this year, Trump removed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day and Juneteenth from the list of federal holidays that people can access national parks for free. So he said not those, but he adds his birthday to the list of days that people can go to the national parks for free. Let's think about that. It is removing the idea that Juneteenth and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day are days to be celebrated with free entrance. Most national holidays, you can go into their with free entrance. It takes those holidays, and we're going to focus on Juneteenth now because that's what our lecture is about, and it places it as something lesser than, something lower than, something that is not worthy of being brought into the fold of an America at 250 or having free entrance at a national park service, but supplants it with Trump's birthday. And that's a level of narcissism that we won't even begin to attack. So we'll just leave that right there. But I say that this attack on Juneteenth, because that is what I view it as. That is kind of the continuation of an attack on a holiday, of an attack on the value and the ideologies of a holiday. This attack did not start with a dictate that said you cannot go to the National Park Service for free on Juneteenth. This started long before that. It even started long before this. But I think that this article coming out of the Progressive last summer indicates how pervasive this new administration has been in demonizing Juneteenth. And so the article itself, entitled From Celebration to Cancellation, How Juneteenth Became a Casualty of America's Reactionary Turn, it talks about city after city after city in the South, in the North, in the Midwest, who last summer canceled their Juneteenth celebrations. Juneteenth really started to become something that more and more places across the country celebrated after 2020, and we'll talk about why that is in just a moment. But these celebrations by last summer were publicly deemed too woke as part of culture, and mayors all over the country said, we are not going to invest in celebrating this. It becomes a continuation of these kinds of anti-CRT, which really is anti-Black kind of demonstrations of coming from this White House. And it was a mounting campaign, even before the election of Trump. This comes out of the Heritage Foundation. It was an article that was written by the president of the Heritage Foundation in 2024 in the summer. And it said, don't let the left ruin Juneteenth's meaning. And so we have to look for how things are miscast and misrepresented in these very pernicious ways. So what Roberts did in this article from the Heritage Foundation, which is a hugely influential think tank, essentially, for conservative politics, he doesn't say we shouldn't celebrate Juneteenth. He says that if there are celebrations that are not happening for Juneteenth and people who are not wanting it, it is actually the left's fault, because the left has been divisive. And he said the left is divisive because they have continued to interpret Juneteenth as a form of Independence Day, and says that it should not be equated to an Independence Day. And so that anybody who rejects this is, or anybody who says this is actually racially divisive. And if they are going to, and he uses it as an argument to say we should not have these Juneteenth celebrations. The question I have coming out of Roberts' argument is, why have some cast Juneteenth as an Independence Day? Because the part that he gets right is that some people have said Juneteenth should be viewed as an Independence Day. And I would say I have no issue with that. And in addition to that, I would say Frederick Douglass would have no issue with that. Because if we really begin to investigate July 4th and the ways that people have had issues with July 4th and an Independence Day, it makes sense in a historical context. Last year, I sent out a message to all of our followers and people who are on our mailing list about Frederick Douglass and about what it meant to celebrate Independence Day then and now. And I just want to read you a little piece of that. So Frederick Douglass delivers a speech in 1852 in New York, and he's asked to come there by a group of abolitionists and talk about the meaning of Independence Day. And in the beginning of the speech, he essentially says, do you have me here to mock me? Why would I be here to talk about Independence Day when my brethren are still enslaved, despite the fact that we have this quote unquote independence and 4th of July? And he entitles this speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July? And I note that he rhetorically charged in a speech delivered by him as an abolitionist writer and orator commemorating the nation's Independence Day in 1852. It is an indictment of a nation that toted its adoration for freedom, yet enshrined the enslavement of Black people into the United States Constitution. And it warrants a discussion of the historical parallels we are witnessing today. I wrote this last year, and so many of those historical parallels continue to exist today. I talked about people being seized off of the streets by ICE, being placed in captivity, those who are citizens, those who are legally here, and being treated like animals. Even those who may be undocumented should not be treated in the way that they have been treated. And so I equate questioning this notion of freedom and the 4th of July that Frederick Douglass was interrogating when people were enslaved to thinking about what it means today. And so when people then begin to talk about Juneteenth as a type of Independence Day, because that is the time that the last 250,000 enslaved people in Texas were freed, the argument to me is a very sound one. But this disdain for Juneteenth is undoubtedly a larger pattern of anti-Black racism. So what do I mean by that? I referenced 2020. What happened in 2020? 2020 was a real watershed moment for this country. And what was happening in 2020? Well, we are home witnessing the impact of a pandemic that very initially and for quite some time, we showed the disparate impact that it had on Black and brown people. We are home watching as George Floyd is murdered on television. We are witnessing the video of Ahmaud Arbery. We are seeing what happened to Elijah McClain. All of these things are coming to a head all in one singular moment over the course of just a few months. And as people are watching this, people all over the country and all over the world across racial and ethnic and religious boundaries take to the streets and protest. And it was beautiful. It was a beautiful form of unity. So much so that so many organizations, including the NFL, who had previous to that pushed out somebody like Colin Kaepernick, started to kind of reconcile their own feelings and say, okay, how can we be anti-racist? Target, Costco, organizations, hiring more people, really recognizing the racial disparities in this country and the racism that has existed. And so out of 2020, you have an increase of this racial awareness and people's attempts to mitigate it and to address it. And we are now existing in a backlash to that. We are existing in a backlash to that when we see an attack on CRT, critical race theory. Now, let me be very clear. Nobody teaches critical race theory to kindergartners or high schoolers. I used to teach it. And you know, when I taught it in my upper division Blacks in the Law class at the University of Washington and at Hood College. But what has happened is that the right has conflated critical race theory with just Black history. They have demonized DEI, which is something that actually more so has helped white women the most and other groups. DEI, saying that DEI means you don't have merit to do your job, when in fact those marginalized groups often are more qualified and more competitive because they've had to be than their white male counterparts. But this is part of the backlash, to equate everything to CRT, to say DEI means you don't have merit, and to bring Juneteenth and other aspects of Black history into that and say we can't teach those. We have to have a backlash against that. That is the current moment that we find ourselves in. And we find ourselves in that not only ideologically by politicians, groups like Moms for Liberty and others who speak out against it, but we find ourselves like in this moment in these kind of codified ways. Because the Trump administration, he has signed a number of executive orders to stop teaching critical race theory, to quote, end the indoctrination of children, and to say that people have denigrated the quote, remarkable achievements of the United States, and say that you are not allowed to, any school who gets public funding, say anything that is against the United States. If you go, for instance, to the Emmett Till Memorial, the one that is there in Sumner, the courthouse that Biden signed as a National Park Service space, there's a sign on the door, because the National Park Service is run by the Trump administration, that says, if you are on these properties, you are not allowed to say anything negative about any racial group in this country. When you go now to the Medgar Evers home in Jackson, Mississippi, the park rangers there will tell you that they have been told that they cannot call Byron De La Beckwith, who was a Klansman and the murderer of Medgar Evers, they cannot call him a racist. And so what's coming out of these dictates is an attempt to engage in a revisionist history and to quell any truth that comes out of this history that is uncomfortable, that demonstrates how Black people were systematically attacked and subjugated and oppressed. Juneteenth has come into that. And then last summer, Trump puts out something on social media that got a lot of attention, where he started to say that the museums in Washington, D.C. are out of control and that they are part of this kind of woke culture. I mean, he puts it in caps. The Smithsonian is out of control. All they want you to do is tell you how bad slavery is. Those were some of the comments that were coming out of that, as though slavery wasn't bad, right? This image was in the Smithsonian. Trump ordered it removed. It is an image, a very famous image of a formerly enslaved man, and those are the scars of being whipped, the violence of slavery. He ordered it removed from the Smithsonian, and so many other things. When we don't have that history, we lose historical context in understanding how we arrive at where we are today, and understanding, for instance, that slavery enabled these companies to start their business. It fueled those companies. Most of you have probably done business with at least one or more of these companies. When we can't talk about the past, we fail to understand how, for instance, slavery continues to exist in this country in universities' monies, in the fact that the country's wealth from the sugar industry to the banking industry to the railroad industry, was built on the backs of enslaved people. So what are the implications of condemning Black history, of folding CRT, DEI, et cetera, into this notion of Black history? We remove from society the ability to know the truth, to understand systems of oppression that exist today. We remove from people the ability to know that when we see economic disproportionate neighborhoods, economically marginalized neighborhoods, that the onus, when we think we want to place it on them, has to do with historical processes and racism. What are the implications of condemning Black history? We remove from everybody the ability to do what I just told you in the beginning. Look into the past and say, I'm inspired by that person. I want to be like that person. And so the work that we do here, what do we do when we condemn Black history? We create a culture that enables Trump to remove Juneteenth from a list of federal holidays. I go back to that point. And there's a historical precedence for this. This is not starting with Trump, okay? Trump exists because of what was already brewing in this country. And we are in a position to fight it. And I want us to always remember that. And learning this truth is one of those ways that we can fight it. But we saw this several years ago when Florida's DeSantis was saying that the standards, that he wanted teachers in Florida to teach that African Americans received personal benefit from slavery, when he said he would not allow African American history to be taught as an upper division course. And we saw it long before this with an organization like the National Association of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, because they, early on after their establishment at the turn of the last century, started to push for the rewriting of a history that very much cemented white supremacy and heralded the Confederacy. And that idea of heralding the Confederacy lingers with us today. I did, about a month ago, a TikTok in front of the statue of Jefferson Davis on the state Capitol grounds in Alabama. I have never received more hateful messages on social media, personal messages that were coming to us as DMs, than from doing that. When I did that and said that Jefferson Davis was part of the Confederacy and he's being treated as though he was a legitimate president, people reached out and called me the N-word. They said I should be killed and buried. It was despicable and alarming because it was this reminder that we still have work to do. I will say that the positive comments outweighed the negative, and we always have to remember that. But there are organizations like the Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of the Confederate Veterans, who have for many years tried to establish what we are going to talk about in textbooks, tried to establish a revisionist history that uplifts a Confederacy and that quells the terrible parts of slavery. They wanted to have as a measuring rod every textbook on history and literature in Southern schools be tested by those desiring the truth. And for them, the truth was the truth of a Confederate history. It is part of a broader lost cause narrative. When we see the canceling of Juneteenth celebrations in cities across this country, when we see Juneteenth being removed from the list of days where you can go to the national park for free, this is part of a lost cause narrative. The Southern Poverty Law Center calls the lost cause of the Confederacy. It refers to a collection of political and historical myths that form the bedrock of many notable neo-Confederate slogans. Heritage, not hate, and states' rights have shared roots in the post-Reconstruction effort to revise the indisputable fact of why the South seceded from the Union in the 1860s. Slavery was why they receded from the Union, but they want to supplant that and say, no, it was states' rights. This is about our heritage. And so when it comes to the teaching of race, much of what is happening, this pushing away of the truth, Florida saying that slavery was actually good for Black people, canceling of Juneteenth conversations. It is part of a broader lost cause ideology that is grounded in racism. That is why it exists. And when we take it to Texas, we even see it in their textbooks. Several years ago, people made public that Texas textbooks were referring to enslaved people as migrants. That is not just a slip up. That changes the entire context of history. And the problem with having that in textbooks in Texas is that they order so many textbooks that it becomes the standard for textbooks across the country. And in addition to doing that, The school board of Texas, this is why it's important that we vote in school boards, because in Texas, they have a statewide school board. The school board in Texas began to remove and erase contributions of Black and brown people from their textbooks, like removing Thurgood Marshall, as an example. And so what does Juneteenth mean? And that's completing our section, our part one. What does Juneteenth mean in the context of America at 250? Juneteenth becomes something that too many are deeming not worthy of celebrating. Something that, if equated with a moment of independence, is somehow offensive to a conservative right. Juneteenth becomes something that we should not celebrate, that is not worthy of national celebration. It is still a national holiday, but we will watch to see what happens. So now, what is Juneteenth? How do we arrive at Juneteenth? And I want to check the chat just to make sure I have not missed any questions or anything. Oh, it's Happy Black Music Month. That's fantastic. Norma, you said you post Frederick Douglass' speech every year. I love that. And Yolanda, yes, thank you for pointing that out. The Rangers at the King Center are standing firm and speaking the truth without question. And I will say, so are the ones at the Emmett Till Memorial, or at the Emmett Till National Park, and so are the ones at the Medgar Evers home. They are all continuing to do this work. And that is just so profound of them to do, because they risk losing their jobs at any moment by doing that work. So with number two, now we're getting into the history in Texas. All right. So if you have any questions, put it in here. The myth of the Alamo. And I want to start here, because as we're starting to talk some and learn about slavery in Texas, this is extraordinarily relevant. I've been to the Alamo. If you've been to the Alamo, drop it in here. Remember, the Alamo is the chant that we continuously hear. We are told that the Alamo was fought for Americans, for Texans, white Texans, to break free of the tyranny of Mexican rule. And so we are taught to remember the Alamo as this moment of heroes who are defending the Alamo, who are saying, remember the Alamo, we will not be subject to Mexican rule. What we are not taught is why the Alamo was fought. Why was the battle fought? So Mexico gains its independence from Spain in 1821, and then they begin to establish colonies, and Americans begin to move there. And the Americans who move there, what do they bring with them or purchase? Enslaved people. This is coming directly from the Alamo's site. So here's the kicker. We are not taught that the Alamo was fought to protect white Americans' ability to own slaves. But that's why it was fought. But even on the Alamo's own website, and I took this just in October of last year from that website, it says this: the Texas colonists, quote, autonomy was challenged. What was the autonomy? It was the autonomy to be able to own slaves with the centralization of power in Mexico City. And then it says laws changed, curtailing the influx of immigrants, as well as the autonomy that Texans had grown used to. The autonomy that Texans had grown used to was very specifically their ability to own enslaved people. The Texas Revolution and the Battle of Alamo were fought because white Texans wanted to protect the institution of slavery. That is something we are not taught. That is something that the Alamo itself does not publicize, and that is exactly what the truth is. The erasure of Black history affects our students. Absolutely. Andrew, thank you for that. And many of you are teachers, and I want to acknowledge that you all, many of you, because we hear it from you, are facing a lot of challenges in simply trying to teach the truth. That is why we work so much with educators. That is why we are here. That's why we try to create community to empower you. So just stay steadfast, and we are here for you. And so the Alamo fought to protect slavery. Mexico sought at one point to ban slavery. Here's how this plays out. In 1829, President Vincent Guerrero, and I don't speak Spanish well, so forgive me for not saying that correctly, who was Black and indigenous in his descent. He abolished slavery in Mexico. But the Texas settlers were exempt from that decree. And so they were nonetheless concerned that the abolition of slavery was coming for them. And by 1837, Mexico said no exception. So they were correct in that. That's the end of slavery was going to be something that was countrywide for them. Now, by the time Texas gains its independence in 1836, the total population was about 38,000, and there were about 5,000 enslaved people. By the end of the Civil War, the population of enslaved people in Texas would be 250,000. And so by the eve of Juneteenth, it was the last 250,000 enslaved people in the country who were freed. How does that measure against the total enslaved population? The total enslaved population in the country at the time was about 4 million. So a very sizable number actually existed in the state of Texas. The Constitution of the Republic of Texas, which was drafted in 1836, assured white settlers that they could migrate to Texas with their enslaved people. This was their concern. This is why they fought in the Battle of Alamo. This is straight from the Texas Constitution. All persons of color who were slaves for life previous to their immigration to Texas and who are now held in bondage shall remain in the like state of servitude. Congress shall pass no laws to prohibit immigrants from the United States of America from bringing their slaves into the Republic with them. Because remember, Texas was a Lone Star state for a number of years. And Texas's slave population continued to grow largely because of the domestic slave trade. If you have not heard of the domestic slave trade, some of you have. Some of you who are on this call have actually been with me as we're standing at the banks of the Alabama River in Montgomery, Alabama, and talking about the slave trade. If you have not heard of the domestic slave trade, it was something that existed by the late 1700s all the way through the Civil War, and it was a transition of enslaved people from the upper South, like Maryland and Virginia, and the North, like New York and Pennsylvania, New Jersey and Delaware, into the South and into the deep South. And so as the land begins to open up in the South, like the purchase of Louisiana purchase in 1803, in addition to Georgia's land opening up for what we were told is farming, because indigenous people were forcibly removed from Georgia and their own sovereign lands. They were paving the way, Americans were, for the expansion of slavery into these things. There are multiple factors that coalesce to create this domestic slave trade where people are being sold from the North and the upper South into the South. That's another lecture for another day. But if you don't know much, I encourage you to look more into it. We can talk more about it at the end of this lecture. But what I will say is, as large as it was, it's something that really is not taught in school. And I know for many of our great educators on this call, they now teach it or have always taught it. 1.2 million enslaved people, 1.2 million enslaved people sold from the upper South and the North into the deep South. About 50% of Black families were estimated to have been separated because of the domestic slave trade. And so as people are beginning to expand their cotton production, sugarcane production, rice production in the South, they are purchasing these individuals. And so Texas's enslaved population grows in the 1800s because of the domestic slave trade. What was the impact of that domestic slave trade? A, it was the separation of nearly 50% of people, of Black families. B, about 20% of those who were sold into that slave trade were children under 10 years old, often children sold on their own into this slave trade. And it expands the economy of the South. In addition to that, there was an illegal slave trade that largely came into places around Texas. So in 1808, you are not allowed to import Black people from Africa anymore per the US Constitution. That is one of the reasons why the domestic slave trade existed. When you have an expansion of an economy in the South, when you are desirous of more free labor for the farms, the cotton, the sugarcane in the South, but you are no longer legally allowed to import people from Africa, you turn north. You look north, you look to the upper South and purchase people from Maryland and Virginia and all these other states to be sold into the South. But that did not stop an illegal slave trade from West Africa. It is estimated that every decade of the early 1800s, approximately 30,000 illegal enslaved people from Africa were smuggled into the Gulf of Mexico and into these different ports that you see. And one of them was Galveston, Texas. And so a number of the people who would be freed in Galveston and around the state would actually be individuals who could have been born not in the North, but actually in Africa. I worked on a number of public history projects while I lived in Texas when I was doing my master's degree there. And we noticed in the burial practices, because one of them centered on a cemetery there in Dallas, and I'm actually going back to Dallas next week to help update that exhibit that we did. One of the burial practices were very much West African. And so we understood that a lot of that was because of this illegal slave trade and people bringing their culture in the immediate years before emancipation into Texas. So what did slavery look like then in Texas before we get to Juneteenth and the freeing of individuals? By 1850, there are about 58,000 enslaved people in Texas. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, 182,000. By the end of the war, 250,000. Why such an increase in these short number of years? As we are engaged in this war, enslavers purposefully would take their enslaved people and move them to Texas to move them away from Union troops who were marching through the South and freeing people, to move them away from the geopolitics and the exchange of information that was happening from plantation to plantation, so that Black people knew that they could run away. They knew that emancipation was on the horizon. They were moving them away from the physical troops, moving them away from the information that they could have had, and moving them into Texas. That's why we have a jump from 1860 to 1865 during the war of 70,000 increased number of enslaved people being moved into Texas. Most of them are in the three-fifths eastern portion of the state. And when I have done my research on lynching, that is exactly where the majority, almost every single one to the number, the majority of the over 700 lynchings took place as well, is in the eastern three-fifths of the state. Lynching has a direct correlation to the existence of slavery in a population and the ways in which Black people were subjugated and violently dealt with. So the process of freedom then, how do we take those 250,000 people who are in Texas and arrive at Juneteenth? I don't say freedom comes in a singular swoop. It doesn't. You can, April 9th, the Civil War ends, freedom comes. Okay, but freedom had come long before that. And I call it a process because it is a process that was engaged in and started by African Americans themselves. If we think about freedom as a process, a huge step in that process was self-emancipation, running away. 4 million enslaved people on the eve of the Civil War. It is estimated that 500,000 of them at least picked up and ran away. And I want to think about what that means when somebody runs away. My husband, I've told the story just a couple of times. He's from Texas, actually. And his ancestors were enslaved in Texas and in Louisiana. And when I met him, we've been together 30 years this September, married 25. When I met him, his parents were living in East Texas, in Port Arthur, Texas. So we're driving. I had never lived in Texas before. I met him when I was in graduate school. Here I am coming from Chicago and Arizona, and we see an alligator on the side of the road. And I was dumbfounded. And I said, is that like a normal thing that you see? And I think for some of you who live in Texas or Florida, you see them all the time. So you forget how jarring it is for someone who doesn't live in those environments. And he said, yeah, we see them all the time. And ever since then, I've always thought about running away. I was like 22, thought about running away in such a different context, because what it requires for people to run away is not only escaping what were called the slave catchers and the dogs, the actual Spanish hounds that they had that could rip people to shreds, but also worrying about the punishment, which could include slicing of your Achilles, boxing of the ears, castration, and the elements, the alligators, the water moccasin, the ants, all of these things that people were willing to take on and run away. 500,000 of them. And many of them would form what they called contraband camps. This is an actual picture of a contraband camp in Hampton, Virginia. They would go to where the Union soldiers' camps were and go to the entrance of them and say, we have run away and we are seeking refuge. The federal government, as part of this process of freedom, actually had to pass a law that says you cannot return anybody to slavery who has come to the Union camps seeking freedom. Esri has told me that there's a question in the chat about information on the domestic slave trade. I'm going to send you all a recording of this, and I will send some books on the domestic slave trade for that. And I may be doing a lecture on it soon, but I'll send you some information on where you can learn. There are some great online resources too. This is a picture of a school at a contraband camp. It was illegal to teach Black people how to read and write. So one of the things they tried to do when they got to the contraband camp, and there were Black women actually who were teaching these children, Black free women, teach them how to read and write. There were potentially none, and some have said perhaps one contraband camp in the state of Texas, which is interesting because in all of these other states, there were many in Virginia and across the South. There were multiple, especially in the Upper South, multiple contraband camps in Maryland. They were called contraband because General Benjamin Butler, who was at Fort Monroe in Virginia, deemed them as part of this contraband of war. So by 1864, there are 17,000 formerly enslaved people living in Union camps. But because Texas provided this kind of distance away from these Union camps, then enslavers were happy to move enslaved people there. And there's reportedly none. There's been evidence of potentially one contraband camp in the state of Texas. Yet another reason why the enslaved population of Texas increases during the Civil War, because you could physically remove people from the pathway of freedom, both ideologically and physically. And then the Emancipation Proclamation comes, another step in this process of freedom. And so on September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln issues this. And what does he say? He says that people who are enslaved in rebelling territories, so anywhere that is still held by the Confederacy, would be free by January 1st, 1863. It did not free slaves in Union areas. So what does that mean? Those states that are in blue, that were slave states but part of the Union, their enslaved people did not get free. I just moved from Maryland. Maryland was part of the Union, but it was a slave state. It did not grant freedom to enslaved people until November of 1864. 6 months before the end of the war. So if you are enslaved in a rebelling territory, you are now free. But what does that actually look like? For many people, it did not give them freedom. Are you going to go up to the Confederate soldiers and say, get out of my way, I'm free? That's not how typically it worked. What often did happen is Union soldiers who were coming through those areas, particularly those with Black soldiers with them, would take those enslaved people with them as they're walking. And it's been commented that the Black Union soldiers took great pride in being able to march into Confederate-held territories as Union soldiers and emancipate people. But one of the things that the Emancipation Proclamation did do was allowed for Black military service. And Black people would join the Army and the Navy, about 180,000 Black soldiers, here they are, from the 54th Massachusetts, and about 20,000 members of the U.S. Navy. Those who were free, those who were runaways, those who were formerly enslaved could join and take part in this freedom. And it also signaled to enslaved people that freedom was becoming part of this war. Lincoln did not go to war to free people. Lincoln was against slavery and he didn't own enslaved people, but he publicly stated in his inauguration address that if he could bring the country back together without freeing a single person, he would. He did not go to war to free Black people, but the South did secede from the Union to maintain slavery. So when people say, was the war fought for slavery from the South perspective? Yes. Was the war fought for slavery from the Northern perspective, from the Union perspective? No, initially it was fought to bring the country back together. But and his biographers write about this, as Lincoln would see these runaway individuals lining the streets near the Capitol and other places he traveled, he saw that Black people were making this war about themselves. And they say that influenced his issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so the Emancipation Proclamation was set to take hold on January 1st, 1863. It is a signal to enslaved people that the tides of this war are turning, that the war is becoming potentially about freeing us. And so they engaged in what would be called Night Watch. Freedom's Eve, December 31st, 1862 was called Freedom's Eve, where Black people who were free gathered in homes, who were enslaved gathered in their homes, spaces of worship, and they waited for midnight to come, because at midnight, the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. These Night Watch services actually still exist today in some churches. They have them to commemorate this. And people talk about this being, it's not a Juneteenth, but it's kind of an early Juneteenth, because it is a celebration of freedom. And so these Night Watch services are almost like an early kind of Juneteenth. And then freedom comes across the country on April 9th, 1865. So this process of freedom, the war ends, people begin to look for their loved ones, rebuild their lives, establish their own schools, and there would be 4 million formerly enslaved people who were rebuilding their lives in freedom. And about 90% of them would live in the American South. Reconstruction takes hold in 1865 to 1877. There are 3 Reconstruction amendments. We will only talk about this one, but it's the 13th, 14th, and 15th. A little bit about the 15th. But the 13th Amendment essentially grants freedom. It abolishes slavery, except for something like convict leasing, which is a whole other lecture, but convict leasing is something you should write down and learn more about. And it is the ability for people to arrest, and it was primarily Black people, 95+%, for petty crimes like speaking too loudly in front of a white woman or walking next to a railroad track. They're not actual crimes. Laws were passed to criminalize these behaviors so that Black people could be arrested and then leased out to industry. It was highly profitable. The state of Alabama, for instance, by 1898, 73% of its state revenue came from convict leasing. So it abolishes it except in the case of punishment. That is a clause that's in the 13th Amendment. But the 13th Amendment comes, and the people who did not know about what happened with the 13th Amendment, nor with April 9th, would be those 250,000 enslaved people in Texas. All right, I'm just going to pause here to make sure I'm not missing any questions or comments. I see some things in the chat. Yes, we will get the domestic slave trade. You've been to the Alamo, the gulf between the Alamo and its visitors. Yes, it's almost shocking, John, to see kind of the ways that this public history is presented there. In 1860, the census has this 182,000 enslaved people, as I mentioned, 250,000 by the end of the war. Many of them likely knew the Union was winning the war. They were still subject to geopolitics. They still heard from indigenous people who would often pass information to individuals who were at different plantations. They may have even known about the Emancipation Proclamation, but it held little sway over their lives. There is still a power structure that is in play. And enslavers in Texas were not going to free their enslaved people. And many others were not aware that they had freedom. They did not know that the Civil War had ended. And the absence of having these contraband camps and Union encampments in Texas often prevented Black people from knowing exactly what was happening in that particular moment. And so when word gets to Washington that these 250,000 Black people in Texas are still enslaved, 250,000 out of 4 million, it's really overwhelming to think about the number of people. General Gordon Granger, goes into Galveston with about 2,000 troops. Some have estimated that it's much more, that it could have been far more thousands, and that many of them were actually African-American troops. And in story given sometimes to legend and given sometimes to fact, and there are a couple of versions of it, that he stood on horseback. Another is that he stood on the balcony of a villa, of a hotel, and he read General Order Number 3 out loud, and it was printed verbatim in the newspaper, and it brought news of freedom to these last 250,000 enslaved people in Texas on June 19th, hence the phrase Juneteenth. This is Major General Gordon Granger. This is an actual image of him. And this is from the newspaper, Galveston newspaper at the time. This is what it read, which would free the last 250,000 people. So imagine his standing on horseback, standing at the hotel. Some say it was both, that he actually went to different places in Galveston and read General Order Number 3. And he says this: the people of Texas are informed, the people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired help. The freedmen are advised to remain, so they told them to remain at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, which is the contraband, and they will not be supported in idleness, either there or elsewhere, which that last part's kind of a slap in the face. People who are working 7 days a week, sun up to sundown, and beyond. Juneteenth celebrations begin nearly immediately. They are free, and they would encompass these early Juneteenth celebrations, and even today in some places, rodeos, fishing, baseball games, fairs, and other celebratory measures. Here's an image from a Juneteenth celebration in 1900. Here's Austin at the turn of the century. And I want to talk some about what life looked like after Juneteenth in Texas, because it wasn't all roses, but I also want to talk about the migration of a Juneteenth culture. I moved to Arizona in 1984 when I was 10, so, gives me my age, from Chicago. When I was in Chicago at the time, never heard of Juneteenth as a 10-year-old, never talked about it. When I moved to Arizona that first summer, we went to a Juneteenth event. Juneteenth was celebrated excessively. It still is. It's huge here in Arizona. That is the migratory pattern. Juneteenth has become something that has been celebrated more nationally since it became a national holiday, and in this post-2020 era, because I talked about kind of 2020 as this watershed moment of a racial awakening, and more people started to celebrate Juneteenth. But the reason for that, the reason why in 1984, when I'm a young girl in Arizona learning and celebrating Juneteenth, is because of migratory patterns. When people migrate, they take their belongings and they take their culture with them. And during the second Great Migration is when you see more Black people leaving the South and going to the West. During the first Great Migration, people, which is around World War I, both sides of it, and just after, they're moving from the South into the North and into the Midwest. But the second Great Migration, they're moving to the West, to places like Seattle, California, San Francisco, Oakland, because they're engaging in the war industry. And a lot of those factories, Boeing and others, were on the West Coast. And many of them during the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression are leaving places like Texas and Oklahoma and going to Arizona. And so as they're moving to the West, what do they take with them from Texas? They take that culture of celebrating Juneteenth. Texas actually had the lowest rate in the country of outmigration during the Great Migrations. Only about 20%. That's the lowest in the country. Texans were most likely to move from rural areas to cities. But for those who did leave, they took that Juneteenth celebration with them, which is why in 1984, I arrived in Phoenix and it's already a huge celebration. I see a question. Official that did not get off the ship at all, that it was Black soldiers. That's right, Gladys. Thank you. There are a number of reports. Black soldiers are the ones who posted it and read it. And it's really just in recent years where people started to talk about the Black soldiers who were with Gordon Granger. So as we move into what life was like in our last kind of segment here, what life was like in Texas in a post-emancipation era, and then I want to talk about, so we have about 15 minutes or so, how we arrived at this national holiday. I want you to place yourself in the narrative. And I often ask people to do this, because if you are an individual who's being transitioned from slavery to freedom, and particularly that's highlighted, what would you do? What is one thing that you might do in those current areas? The Warmth of Other Suns, a great read on migration. Thank you. What is one thing that you might do as you're transitioning from slavery to freedom? I want you to drop that in the chat. So you were enslaved, you're building a new life in freedom. What might you do? Look for family. Absolutely. People would look for their family. The newspapers at the time are filled with ads of people looking for family. 50% of their families separated from the domestic slave trade. Certainly in Texas, they are looking for their families. They are building businesses. They are creating towns. There are a number of towns all over, for instance, Oklahoma and Texas, Black incorporated towns, because they may not be migrating to the north, but they're migrating to safe spaces. Actually, when I go next week to Dallas, I'm going to be working on something called Freedman Cemetery. It was something I did as a young scholar. I was like, I can't believe I was like 23 years old, 24 years old when I was working, 23, geez, when I was working on that. And we created an exhibit, and it was about North Dallas, Black North Dallas. And North Dallas grew up because after emancipation, Black people from all over the state migrated there to what was a cemetery for enslaved people. They built a portion of Dallas around this cemetery. You see this all over the country. People are saying they started schools. Absolutely. They bought land when they could. They voted. In addition to that, that was one of the big things that they did. They started community. They found freedom. They legalized their marriages. They created these towns. When their children were taken as apprentices under the Black codes, they fought and sued in court. They fought for equality in the court. When Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat, that was not the first moment of a civil rights movement. It started long before that. They engaged in sit-ins when they were segregated, even in northern communities. They did all of these things. They built their own buildings. The picture that you are looking at is called the Pythian Temple in Dallas, and it was built by William Sidney Pittman, who was a Black architect. William Sidney Pittman was married to Portia Washington. Portia Washington was Booker T. Washington's daughter. They moved to Dallas together and were part of building a post-emancipation Black community. The building that has been there for over 100 years, it has now been turned into a hotel, which I love, called the Pittman Hotel. And many of them left. They moved to places like Mexico or under other places. But for Black people in Texas, they were subject in the immediate post-war era to a tremendous amount of violence. So much so that there had to be a hearing before the United States Senate because of the violence that they were subject to. The Texas Almanac in 1865 lamented the loss of free labor. What are we going to do now with all the cotton that needs to be picked? It said that Black people should have been indebted to slavery for their advancement, originally from a state of humanity, the lowest and most degraded known to mankind, to one comparatively civilized. I swear, if somebody told me DeSantis wrote that when he said learning the value of slavery, I would believe you. Because it is this old, antiquated ideology that is finding its way into the ways that some of these conservatives are saying that we should teach history, i.e., the dictate in Florida saying that slavery was actually good for Black people. Reads like the Texas Almanac from 1865. This is just a list. When I was living in Texas, I did a lot of research in the Freedmen's Bureau papers as well as the Reconstruction documents. And what I found was page after page after page after page of the violence that was heaped upon formerly enslaved people following Juneteenth. And this is just some of them. 2 freedmen killed by William Spencer when he ordered them to return to their former master, and they refused. Miss Morse, inhumanely beaten. A white man whipped and then threatened to kill Ellen, a free woman of color, for attempting to leave his employ. So if they said, I am going to leave here, then you are considered to be recalcitrant. 2 white men, Amos Faulkner and Mark Lively, hanged John Wynne, a free man of color, to make him disclose things that he knew nothing about. Charity, a free woman of color, given 100 lashes after she entreated Mrs. Beard not to flog her daughter. This is after emancipation. It is written about over and over and over again. The United States Congress published a report in 1862, and it was about the lawlessness and violence in Texas that formerly enslaved Black people were experiencing. And the report said this: the committee insisted we are authorized by facts to affirm that multitudes who participated in the rebellion, disappointed and maddened by their defeat, are now intensely embittered against the freedmen on account of their emancipation and enfranchisement, and against the loyal whites for their persistent adhesion to the Union. So it was white Union soldiers and those coming to the South, as well as Black people who were subject to this violence. And the committee said that it is our solemn conviction that the courts, especially juries, as a rule, will not convict ex-rebels for offenses committed against Union men and freedmen. It becomes no wonder then that Texas had such a distinct and pervasive lynching culture, because acts of violence against Black people went completely unchecked. The Freedmen's Bureau agent in Texas, at one instance, arrested a white man for severely beating a Black man, and the local authorities sent the assailant to trial. The jury found him guilty, and they fined him only 1 penny. It's a slap in the face. In another case, it ended with the release of white men. The courts retorted, this is what they said, that they would not send a white man to jail for an N-word. This is the environment that Black people in Texas were subject to in this post-emancipation era. But yet, they established communities, they built their own businesses, they voted, they elected Black officials during Reconstruction. Because during Reconstruction, with the military occupation of the South, where you literally have, this is a picture of Union troops moving into these different areas in the South being divided during Reconstruction into 5 military districts, and Union troops standing there, standing guard by 1867, saying, we are going to enable Black people to vote without being killed. You had a high level of Black voter participation. And in Texas, you had a number of Black people who were elected. In 1867, the United States Congress passed the first Reconstruction Act, which granted Black people the right to vote. Nearly 2,000 Black elected officials across the country. And it is important to remember that the 15th Amendment, which says you cannot take somebody's right to vote based on race, the 15th Amendment is ratified in 1870. Black men could already vote for 3 years by 1867. So they actually helped to deliver to us the 15th Amendment. It was a time called Negro domination, because Black people were so prominent in local politics. There would be a backlash to that. That is saved for another lecture. That's something we talked about at the teach-in this weekend. But the backlash to that is at the end of Reconstruction, you would have a rise in Jim Crow and the disenfranchisement of Black people. But before that, and before we get to just our last few minutes, I want to tell you a story. And I want you to drop in the chat what this story reveals to you about life in Texas following the Civil War. There's not one right answer. There are a number of right answers, okay? They're all right answers. I'm not going to tell you any of your answers are wrong, because it's what you perceive. But as I tell you this story, drop in the chat what you think some of the kind of takeaways from the story are when we talk about history serving as this kind of inspiration. And what does it mean? It's not all inspirational, but some of it really is. In Milliken, Texas, that is one of the areas that Black people began to migrate to following the Civil War. But there were growing tensions between Black and white people. Black people moved there. They established community and business. One of their leaders, George Brooks, who was formerly enslaved, became a head registrar, and he would go around and organize voters and get Black people to vote and register them to vote. He helped get a Black person sent to the Constitutional Convention for Texas. This was in the immediate years following enslavement. They were organizing, they were building community in Milliken. And then an incident happened on June 7th, 1868, involving the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan emerges in 1866, 1 year exactly following the emergence of...
Is this still patient building?
Stop. I hate when we have these ads. 340B markups. The Ku Klux Klan emerges in 1866.
Donald Trump is crushing D.C.
1 year following
From federal agencies
the
to home rule, our city is under attack. In the delegate...
And what you're going to see here in this video is the Klan marching through Washington, D.C. Because by the 1920s, the Klan had become fully entrenched in politics and in society across the country. And you see them marching unmasked in Washington, D.C. But by the early portion of when they became an organization in 1866, coming out of Pulaski, Texas, they would terrorize Black people across the country. And then by the time they reemerged in the 19-teens, they would include in their terrorist efforts terrorizing Jewish people and Catholic people as well. But the story that centers on Milliken involves the Klan, very newly formed in Texas, the branch that would come and attack them. I can never get over this footage because to see them marching unmasked tells us everything we need to know about the ways in which people were not concerned about hiding their racism. And indeed, we have a return to that in so many ways today. I do believe more than just paralleling. In some ways, history repeats itself. But what history does is it arms us with the ability to say, oh, we've seen this happen again, and we're not going to allow it to happen. And so the Klan in Milliken, Texas, was upset about the freedom expressions of Black people in the area. They were upset that they were building their own community, that they were succeeding, that they had their own businesses, that they had their own churches. And so they wanted to intimidate them. They were mostly upset that they were exercising their political power, that they were organizing voters, and that they were voting in those elections. And they were able to vote in those elections because Union soldiers were there stopping people from killing them, quite literally. And so one day during church on June 7th, 1868, Brooks, the Black leader I just told you about, he was a pastor. He was presiding over church service, and the Klan started to march outside that church, mask on. But what happened was that the Black men in the church took their guns, because they were all armed, still Texas, still these immediate post-war era, and they went outside and they started to shoot at the Klan. They didn't just let themselves be intimidated. They fought back. And the Klan ran. The newspaper articles of the time talk about how just remnants of Klan outfits were left on the ground. And the Klan ran off, scared. They protected their community. And so for the weeks after that, Black men started to march publicly, practice marching with their guns as a show of strength and say, don't come in here doing this anymore. But weeks later, Brooks went missing and he was found murdered. So they knew that was in retaliation. So there's a lot to this story. What does this story reveal about Texas and Black people in Texas at the particular time? I'm going to ask you to drop some of your answers in here. What does it tell you? What do you garner from the story? There are different elements of it. I'll tell you one that I take away from there. One that I take away from there is the sheer courage that it took for people to move to Milliken and build community. That they got up and they left wherever they were. They left the employee of their employers, their former enslavers, and you saw how violent that was, that they could be beaten for doing so. And they went and they built community in Milliken. They fought back. We often don't hear about that. We think of Black people, we are taught that they're very passive and that they don't fight back. There are different ways to fight back. And they fought back not only by community building, they fought back by going outside and saying, you're not going to come here. They built a strong enough community to fight back collectively. It reveals their courage and their bravery. No question. Give me liberty or give me death, Sally Joe said. Right. They fought back. It also demonstrates something about our idea about crime. They were criminalized for their freedom expressions. They were criminalized for having political power. What they were doing was seen as something that was negative, something that needed to be stopped. But despite that, they still fought back. They continued to build their efforts. That's where the Black Panthers got their impulse. Right. It is like kind of this early notion of I mean, it's what the Black Panthers, when they first formed in 1966 in Oakland, they were armed and said, we are going to protect ourselves and our communities. That is exactly correct. And that's what we see coming out of Milliken, despite the strength of the Klan. Milliken tells us that Black political power was considered a threat, but it also tells us that nothing stopped these Black Texans. I write about Milliken actually in my book. I love just having learned about that and writing about it and sharing that story, because Milliken is one example of so many communities across the country. Mount Bayou, Mississippi is another. Mount Bayou, Mississippi was established at the turn of the last century in the late 1800s, and it is a place where Mamie Till stayed during the trial of her son, many miles from Sumner, because it was a Black community that was impenetrable. That when the Klan tried to come in there in the 1920s, they used a Gatling gun to scare them away. And so she was able to stay there for safety. People finding safety in numbers. It's like Sweet Auburn Avenue that so many of you have walked down. So Juneteenth celebrations, these Marymounts that include all those things that I had mentioned to you. Here's in Houston's Park. So as you can imagine, in Texas, Juneteenth celebrations, despite the violence, despite everything else, they rise. They reject it. They continue to celebrate their freedom. Here's a parade from Houston. I adore these old pictures. Houston's Fourth Ward. My husband used to live there actually. In 1908, one of the celebrations that they had. And this migration of that culture all the way to places like Arizona and California. Now, what about in our last few minutes, and we'll open it up for any questions you might have or comments or anything you want to say, the road to becoming a national holiday. So it was Representative Al Edwards, who was actually a Democrat out of Houston, who first proposed this in 1979. And he put forth legislation, which was House Bill 1016, to officially recognize Juneteenth as a holiday, which is fascinating because it had been celebrated for more than 100 years previous to him putting this through. The lack of it being a federal or even a statewide holiday did not stop people from celebrating it across the state. It would become a federal holiday in 2021. And this is President Biden signing the legislation that would recognize Juneteenth as a federal holiday. And it was very much this awareness that grew out of not just the murder of George Floyd, but out of 2020 and the different things that were happening, that Juneteenth becomes something where Biden says we are going to federalize this, and others pushed him to do this. He said this on the day that he signed it. This is a day of profound weight and profound power. A day to remember the moral stain, the terrible toll that slavery took on the country and continues to take. It is not a rant about how it's too bad that the Smithsonian is talking about how bad slavery is and that it's all bad, according to this current president. It is an acknowledgement of saying that slavery took a toll in a country, and we are going to celebrate these moments like Juneteenth and nationalize them and federalize them so that all people can learn about the history of Juneteenth. So one of the things I'm going to encourage you to do, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, not on Juneteenth, but long before, is if you can, find a local Juneteenth event and go and enjoy it. Let's celebrate. Celebrating Juneteenth, in my estimation, at this time in our history and our political climate, constitutes an act of resistance in many ways. All right. Thank you. Any questions, comments? I'm going to come off so we can do that. John King said, for me, the story of Black survival post-Reconstruction is overlooked. It very much is. So you want to learn more about that. There are a number of books that exist where we can talk about that. Okay, Norma. Norma is from Tuskegee. Hello, Norma. She is chairing Tuskegee's Juneteenth. So anybody who is in Alabama or Florida, come to the Tuskegee's Juneteenth event. That would be great. And find a local one. All right, Norma, thank you. That's great. I know we have a number of them in Phoenix. For any of you who are here, if you're in Maryland, all these different places, you have a lot of different Juneteenth events. Okay. And I will be doing a write-up, and I think most of you are on our newsletter where I'm going to write kind of a story of Juneteenth that I'll send on Juneteenth, and we'll send this recording and some of those things on the domestic slave trade, as well as those immediate moments after Reconstruction. Saturday, Anderson, Indiana. Thank you, Faye. And thank you, Amy. Thank you all for showing up. Good, Sally Jo. I'm glad you're going to show this to your grandchildren and their high school friends on Juneteenth. That is fantastic. That's a great way. Yes, please. Yes, I'm going to send you the video, so do show it to your grandchildren. That would be beautiful. And thank you, Esri Scott. Shares my last name because she is, in fact, my daughter. She's doing our back end today, made sure that my volume was okay. You guys could see the whole lecture. And she's in New York right now, a few hours ahead like some of you. So Esri, thank you so much. Okay, and I'm going to be sending out an email about the book. So I encourage you all to buy it. It's a beautiful book. It looks like a piece of art. We've put all that we can into it. Yes, On Juneteenth by Annette Gordon-Reed is beautiful. That's a perfect book. And there's a novel about Juneteenth by Richard Wright as well. But we're going to send information on the book because we would really love for you all to buy it. Every single dollar of profit goes to our work with educators. All right, everybody. Thank you. Happy Juneteenth. Thank you, Sally Jo. Great. I'm glad you're going to get the book. If you are in Seattle, we're having a book launch event July 10th at our office. So contact me. I can send you out that information. We'll have wine and hors d'oeuvres and all kinds of things. Everyone have a beautiful night. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.